Hi, everybody. Welcome to Tapping the Wine Cellar. I'm Margaret Hike, the Director of Communications for the Missionaries of the Precious Blood, Kansas City Province. You can learn more about the Missionaries of the Precious Blood at our website, preciousbloodkc.org. Father Keith, Vicky, Tim, and I are again happy to welcome Sister Mumbi Kigutha to share with us today. Sister Mumbi lives in Chicago and works with the Jesuit Refugee Service. And before we turn it over to Father Keith, I want to invite Sister Mumbi to talk a little bit about the work she does. And she's really been involved in a lot lately. So, Sister Mumbi, I'm going to unmute you and you can go for it.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be with you this afternoon. And since my work with JRS tends to be me traveling back to Africa to work in displaced people contexts in different countries, COVID-19 kind of put a stop to most of that. And I began volunteering at the food depository because there was a huge food emergency problem that happened all over the world just because of COVID-19. But then George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and also the situation in Central Park with Amy Cooper happened. And I started protesting. I started joining the protests as a Black woman, a Black nun. We are a minority in this part of the world. I felt this as a personal call to myself, but also a way to show solidarity. And so I have joined many protests and I have been amazed by the leadership being displayed by young people. And it's inspiring just to be amongst them and to see the passion they have and that they are tired of the status quo. And we know the status quo is not working, but they're actually saying enough and we have to try a different way and we have to include everybody in the struggle. And that is why I'm wearing my t-shirt because in a rapidly changing world, we quickly forget issues. Protests are still happening all over this country and around the world, but we have moved on to the next news cycle. But this has been a struggle that has been going on for 401 years, and the changes that people are asking for and demanding are not even halfway to being met. So we cannot afford to forget this, because racism underlies so many of societal issues, not just in this country, but in many parts of the world. Yes.
Wow. That's so much. And it's really cool. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I hope that we as Precious Blood people remember that we're called to live that way and that we still will work on behalf of all of God's people and draw inspiration from what you're doing. So I'm going to rather clumsily hand it over to Father Keith, who will start us off on our discussion this week for the upcoming gospel readings. So Father Keith, give me just a second here. There you go.
All right. It's humbling to follow someone like Sister Mumbi. But we have a wonderful scripture reading that will lead us into that, because Jesus is talking about how God reveals himself to the little ones, how he reveals himself to ordinary people, how he reveals himself to people on the margins. In Matthew 11, Jesus is on the road. He's teaching as he goes with his disciples. And he's talking about how the gospel is not for an elite, that the gospel is for everyone. And he's also talking about taking his yoke upon us. And for me, right away, that's kind of strange. It seems strange because we think of Jesus, the savior of the world, is, oh my gosh, we're supposed to take his yoke on? Oh my gosh, how horrible. But then again, we're called to imitate Christ. And Christ is probably the least selfish person that ever lived. He wasn't motivated by ego. He wasn't motivated by materialism. He wasn't motivated by reputation. He was just able to be. And he calls his disciples to imitate him in selflessness, in pouring themselves out for others. The other thing that I think is important about the gospel is Jesus' humility. Jesus comes as a simple person. And this is reinforced by the first reading from Zechariah, because it talks about the king. I'm sorry, not Zechariah, Ezekiel. I'm getting old, unfortunately. It talks about the king coming, but the king is doing unkingly things. He's breaking the rod, he's destroying chariots, but he's the one that brings peace through the whole known world, from the river to the sea, is from the two-river area, Euphrates, to the Mediterranean, which is a huge tract of land, the world for the people in the Bible. So Jesus comes to us to take on his humility. And so it's in humility, I hope we all can take up the path of justice. Mumbi, what are your thoughts? I hate to kick it right back to you, but you're the guest. Pick it up.
You know, when you think of humility, I always go back to Pope Francis and how he quickly won over the hearts of not just Catholics, but people of all faiths around the world, because he lived what we have been preaching for so long. And understanding what a powerful platform he had as a leader of not just a church, but a state, the physical abandonment of expensive things like adornments that have become so synonymous with the leaders of the Catholic Church, but also in where he chose to live. But more so, he reached out in those first days as a pope to people who had been important in his life, like a cobbler back in Argentina who used to repair his shoes. He called him personally to thank them, the family, and to apologize for kind of just, moving away. It is not about show, because if it was about show, he would not have been able to sustain it. But we have seen him constantly reach out in quiet ways to the most disenfranchised amongst us. We hear stories of how when he first visited the island of Lampedusa, he flew back with refugee families, but this only came out later. It wasn't publicized, and gave them residence in the Vatican. We have heard about how he ensures that the homeless in Rome are constantly getting fed, and sometimes he appears amongst them without any warning. To me, this is a humility. But, in the gospel, when actually Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and heavily burdened, and I will give you rest," it brings me to think about who are the most burdened right now and who is burdening them. And what is our complicity in adding more burdens and yokes to people than they can bear? And I think that gives me a lot of pause in my own life. It is very easy, even in intending to do good, to add extra burden to people's lives, because we want to have it done our way, or we think we know what is best for the poor and the meek. And this was one of the shadow sides of missionary activity for a long time. It is still the shadow side of when you have the money and you're the benefactor and you're trying to help. It is a shadow side of wanting to say, this is how my money should be used, instead of going to the people and asking, what do you need? What are your priorities? And giving them agency over decisions in their lives. So I've had a lot of thoughts, and I think all these thoughts have been bubbling because today I was in a JRS online session, and of course then that centered refugees again in my head. And I've been thinking, like, how much does my work amongst them, am I doing more harm, or am I actually empowering them and giving them agency and not purporting to speak for them?
Sister, you remind me of, I think the phrase goes, don't give a person a fish, teach them how to fish and how to fend for themselves. So it all was very reminiscent to me. The image for me in this gospel that really struck out was the image of a yoke. Because we always see yokes as on beasts of burden. And like all of us, I reflect upon what burdens am I putting on others, as well intending as I too might be. So what am I building onto other people's yokes? But I love the idea that if we take up the yoke of Christ, it's not so we're weak and powerless. It's just that we're willing to leave that to the Lord and the Lord's mercy and the kingdom, that we're supposed to be help coming onto this earth. So taking up that yoke is not a sense of abandonment or a sense of surrender. It's a sense of helping bring forth the kingdom. And I also happened to just run across something today that some yokes were built for two to ease the burdens. And it just reminds me of, and I think the protests and the young people that we see remind me of, we're not isolated beings. We're supposed to be in this together. We're supposed to be working together to build the kingdom and to support each other. So I like the idea of that Christ's burdens aren't just built for two, but they're built for a lot of people. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim right now and save my next thought.
Well, thanks, Vicky. One of the sad things about not traveling is I don't get to go to Chicago anymore and have drinks with Sister Mumbi in the afternoon. So was I supposed to tell people that we've gone and talked about the volunteer program at a bar? So the thing that I want to focus on is the first reading. I love that beautiful image of what God's kingdom will look like. And it's the imagery that of a king that doesn't look like other kings, and it's pretty familiar to us with the Palm Sunday Gospels, where Jesus rides in on animals that are different from the type of animal that a normal king would ride on. And I was thinking about the trappings of world leaders, especially our presidents, or the presidents of the United States over the last however many years, been riding in limousines, mostly inside of them. And then I was thinking about Jesus as a triumphant leader, or in the case of the Jewish readers in the time when Ezekiel was written, how that would look differently today. Maybe it's like Pope Francis riding in a Ford Focus, instead of whatever previous popes rode in, which I think was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure it was a pretty nice European limousine, correct, or car like that. I'm not an expert in papal transportation, other than that Pope Francis rode in a car that was similar to one I had, which I was pretty excited about. And Margaret also had a Ford Focus at one point, so I know that she was pretty excited about seeing the Pope riding around in a car like ours. But the other thing that I noticed in that is, I was looking at one biblical commentator noted that the Hebrew word that is translated to humble in English is used in other places in the Hebrew scriptures, and it refers to someone who is poor and or socially vulnerable. It's not like this very meek and mild type person. It's just somebody who's poor, who's vulnerable, and that's, poverty is not something we generally associate with our leaders, and it's and the imagery Ezekiel is using is a pretty far cry from what the world values, and especially the glorification of the military and coercive violence as a means to have a peaceful kingdom. It's an image of God's people living and sharing God's love. And this is not the peace we usually have in common, which is the absence of tension, but it is a peace where God's mercy, justice, and forgiveness prevail. And Father Keith looks like he has a comment.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great word you brought up, vulnerability, because when we think about helping people, we think about, gosh, I'm going to be like Superman and come in with my strength to save the day. But the thing that struck me about Pope Francis immediately when he stepped out on the balcony was he invited the world to pray for him. And he's never been afraid to show his vulnerability. And that's also true of Christ. And I think that's true of all of us that really seek to help people honestly. It's not that we have the last word or we have the wonderful gift. And unfortunately, from the colonial period, we have the wonderful gift of Western culture, which is going to make the world a better place. But we bring ourselves as we are, as flawed as we are, as humble as we are, as vulnerable as we are, looking to share the yoke, looking to share life, and hopefully be part of something better just for the fact we're there and we're willing to pull our weight.
I read a connection about I think this gospel really, we don't do this gospel justice with our understanding of 21st century English, because the whole idea of who were the wise, who were the little ones, what does burden mean? I think we put our inflections on it and we don't give it justice. I especially like the idea of the connection of the little ones that the gospel writer talked about in this passage are the same people that were talked about in the Beatitudes, and the connection there. And aren't the Beatitudes what's supposed to be our marching orders as a Christian people? And so if we're not listening to the meek and the mild mannered, we do a grave disservice.
Yeah, and I kind of want to circle back to, Vicky, something you said kind of reminded me of something that, or one of the threads that Sister Mumbi was talking about, which is, working with people who are, vulnerable, like, Jesuit Refugee Services does with, and talking about some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And, I know in my previous job where I worked for Unbound, so sorry for a plug for them as well today, that, one of the things they really talked about, and I've heard this a lot in the development world, is talking about, the financial assistance coming from the global north and turning that over and really trusting that people are going to do what's best for their families, for themselves and their families and their communities. And really having the humility to say that they're going to have the better answers for what they need here and now, rather than me, who's, who has no concept, or has very little conception of what their lives are like, and what their needs are, and really trusting that that they do have the answers for themselves, and they just need a little bit of financial support assistance to go along with that.
I am struck by the connection between the vulnerability and humiliation, and how as human beings we hate to be humiliated, because this exposes our vulnerabilities. And one thing that COVID-19 has done, and also the anti-racism protests going on, is revealing this. It's revealing our vulnerabilities, and we have been humiliated. But this is a Kairos moment. It's when you're able to actually sort out what is important and what is not important. And when I think of, you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned, how many times we hide behind our degrees and our titles and our status. I mean, look at any panel that is called anywhere. You're floored by the number of degrees put there. And the people speaking to these issues, they never call people who are directly affected by the issues. It's we who go in and research and come out and now become the experts. So we become experts on poverty. We become experts on all these things, but they rarely have the people who are directly affected by this and living with this, who cannot opt out, talking. So I'm hoping that the for majority of the world's populations, these two ongoing issues and the decline in economic power for most individuals has brought us down to our knees. And I'm hoping that we use this opportunity to now really listen to what God desires of us, because God's plan for us was not to hoard and to have an excess of everything. It was what young people are modeling to us, that you share whatever you have and together we walk and we make a change for the better. It is questioning and interrogating things that we have taken for granted. It is having those uncomfortable conversations. So I hope that we do not lose the momentum of this. And I fear that the minute we get a vaccine, it will be back to the rat race and trying to recover all we have lost in the time we have been affected by the situation as it is. Yeah.
Well, I have to beg pardon. I'm just about to cough. So why don't somebody else pick it up and I'll come back.
I think one of the gifts of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I hope when our successors and those who come after us look at this moment in history, they will realize the gift that the Black Lives Matter movement has given us is the ability to, the young people just amaze me because they're identifying the social systems, the same systems that the gospel writer today wrote about, that are burdening people unduly, not only with the government, but with the police. They're identifying those systems, and I think it's rippling out into others. And I'd like to also include Holy Mother Church in that system. We still have a long ways to go with Holy Mother Church.
Oh, I'll agree with that. I think as we look at our response to these times, and I think our culture has been so tied up with anger and anger as manipulation. It's been said that he who angers me controls me. There's an old Jewish sentiment about the emotions, old teaching about emotions, that emotions are morally neutral, and it's how you respond to them where you run into evil. I would disagree with that, because I've had issues with anger over years. And I found a couple of quotes from the Buddha, of all people, attributed to the Buddha, that are most good. One of them is, anger is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. And also, anger is like picking up a hot coal to throw it at someone, and you yourself get burnt. Anger shuts our brains off. Anger takes away our compassion. Anger dehumanizes us and dehumanizes others. When we're angry, all we want to do is lash out. And we have a lot of people lashing out today as it is. I saw a picture on the internet. There was a story about a protest going on in a private street in St. Louis. A group of marchers were going to the mayor's house, and a couple of the mayor's neighbors decided to stand on their front stoop, armed to the teeth, because they felt threatened. And I'm not going to go into the whole story about them, because they don't deserve a whole story. But as we seek to work for justice, as we seek to be humble, I think we need to really watch ourselves to not act out of anger at all. We have to always act out of compassion, even for people who seem to deserve to receive our anger. I think that's part of what the first reading is getting at when it's talking about the king that destroys the weapons.
I agree, and the psalm speaks to that. It gives us a guideline to check with ourselves whether we're on the right path. The second verse, it says how the Lord is to us. And we need to ask ourselves, are we gracious? Are we merciful? Are we slow to anger? Do we have great kindness? Are we compassionate? Are we good to all? And the word all is something we struggle with. It's yes, everybody bats. Everybody bats. Because there's always a group that we are trying to exclude. And it's usually the people whom we don't like, or people who show us our flawed side, because the other side is that usually the people who are driving you crazy mirror something about yourself that you don't like, your shadow side. So who do we call all? When we think of the universal church, who is everyone? And this struggle is ongoing and ongoing, because there's always a new group that we are scapegoating. Oh, the church would be perfect if we got rid of them. And in current day church, it is the LGBTQ community. We pile all our problems on them. If only we could get rid of them, the church would be fine. No, everybody is welcome. And our work is not to judge. Our work is to show that radical hospitality that our precious blood spirituality calls us to. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a very tempting thing to lump our people we're angry at, people we dislike, people we think are wrong into the category of God's enemies. It's so easy to demonize others that we don't like. And that's something else I think we need to resist. There are folks that say, oh, we need to purify the church. Well, you know, what do we say before we receive communion? Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. If we're going to be honest about that, we all are on a journey of purification. So we're not in a place where we can stand in judgment over others. We're not at a place to say that somebody else doesn't belong at the feast. So we really have to examine our consciences. I think that's something Dietrich Bonhoeffer brings up in his book, what he was writing when he was part of the underground seminary in Berlin during Nazi times. He had his community, his Lutheran community, do examinations of conscience more frequently, because in the struggle against evil, we have to be more careful of our own thoughts and attitudes and actions and where we're coming from, if we're going to be just people, if we're going to be people of God.
I'm going to jump in here. Ginny Miller joined us today on Facebook. And so circling back to continue with the conversation about anger, Ginny added that anger and strong disagreement does not hurt the other person, but keeps you bound to the sin associated with anger. I'm adding a little bit there, but that's basically what she said.
Well, and that also assumes that other people can't change. And my goodness, other people can change, and we have to remember that. And we have to leave that possibility open. I mean, Martin Luther King wanted to convert the racist, and he saw the possibility for the racist to be converted, even though it was unlikely.
A thread back to the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about Pope Francis, I think one of the ways that we get back to the humility and the meekness of the gospel is what the Pope says when he said we need to get out of the church and go down to the hill and go amongst the people. And I think Gasper would say the same thing. I think that's one of the gifts COVID has given us, if we can get out of our heads and recognize this, is the wonderful spirit God moments that we have with others that are not anywhere near any institutional church. I think PBMR in Chicago was a perfect example of church to me. And I think they would say they're anything but that, but I think they're a wonderful example of church. And my fear is we keep hearing the phrase, well, when we go back, And my fear and my hope is when we go forward, we will celebrate more of these God places and God moments in, especially inspired by Francis.
Okay, does anyone else have anything to add in there? Okay, Father Keith, one moment. Go
Well,
for it.
since we're probably heading to wrap up time here, what I want to say, I hope we learned from COVID-19 is the church isn't a building away from us. One thing that I was thinking of, a wedding that got postponed. The wedding rite calls every Christian home to be a little church. I hope we remember from COVID-19, and if we haven't learned it yet, my goodness, we have more time to learn. All of our homes, even if we're there alone, are called to be little churches, and churches are meant to form us into the image of Christ. Churches are meant to form us into compassionate people who are going to be the presence of Christ in the world. And that's the best I can throw out here right now.
I like that. So since Father Keith called it, we're coming up on the end of our time for today. So Vicky, I'm going to send it to you next.
I just hope that everybody has a wonderful holiday on Saturday. And if you choose to be out with others, wear your mask, wear your mask, wear your mask.
Tim?
So I was, as we were talking about not letting anger get the best of you and not being consumed by that, I was thinking about there's a Catholic sister on Twitter who every day prays for a leader that I will leave unmentioned, and prays that, you know, both for him, for his, you know, more loving, more humble, both public persona and also policies. And, you know, I think making sure that we keep in mind that we pray for each other, especially for those who are in positions of authority, that they really do listen to God's call and really understand that we're supposed to love each other, and we're supposed to encourage each other to love each other, and think and pray deeply about what love means.
All right, and last but not least, we want to thank Sister Mumbi for being with us this week and last week, and encourage her in her work, and say we will be absolutely thrilled when we can have you back again. So I'm going to let you have the last word, Sister Mumbi, before I close us out.
So 3 things. Yesterday was the Feast of the Precious Blood. So happy feast to everybody. We need to continue having the conversations about race in the church and society. It is something that I have talked to many people, white people, and they shy away from having these conversations with their families. We cannot afford not to have these conversations. So buy a book if you do not know how to go about it. Right now, there are so many resources. Ask a friend to guide you on how to have this conversation. But this is the witness we are being called to, is a discipleship we are being called to at this time. And we look back at history so many times and say, when terrible things have happened, I would have been different. So this is your chance to be different and not let this time in history pass you by. And even if you go out, ask yourself, do I really need to be out? We see the cases of COVID as spiking, and if we want to resume life as it was once, we all need to be very careful. So a little sacrifice right now will go a long way to helping everybody resume their normal life. So be safe, and thank you for having me.
Well, we're absolutely thrilled you were able to be part of it. So I am going to close this out today by saying that Tapping the Wine Cellar is a presentation of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood, Kansas City Province. We invite you to check out our other media at our website, preciousbloodkc.org/news. And if you want to learn about Sister Mumbi's work at Jesuit, oh no, Sister Mumbi Singh.
Our congregation, Sisters of the Precious Blood. Please check out our website.
Oh, please give us the address, website address. What is that?
It is www.C.P.S.Dayton.org. I hope so. But if you Google Sisters of the Precious Blood of Dayton, the website will come up.
I'm getting a nod yes from Vicky, so I believe that that is correct. Yes, that is good. All right, so thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a great holiday weekend. For anybody trying to get us at the office, we just remind you the office is closed tomorrow. So have a great 4th of July, and thanks for being with us, y'all.